Hey everybody, my name is Darren Calhoun. My pronouns are he, him, and I serve on the board of Q Christian Fellowship. I'm one of several people were part of our equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. This is our gathering that we do every month, where we learn about these important values and how we can integrate them into our everyday lives and conversations. So we hold this gathering on the first Sundays, and we have various topics. Sometimes we'll have community members share, and other times we'll have guests come in. Tonight, we have some wonderful folks who are some of my favorite conversation partners who have been part of our Q Christian Fellowship community for a number of years. And they are sharing about their experience as parents. And I will let them describe that a bit more in a moment. So, our goal here for tonight is that we grow and increase belonging in every way. How we're doing that at the board level, we are working to ensure that diversity and inclusion are reflected in our speakers, our events, our locations, our staff, and organizational policy. And then we also have this gathering that is focused on the community, where we can be a community of learners and folks who are growing and doing this work in our everyday lives. So, tonight, we'll be talking about the experiences of transgender and gender expansive folks and what it's like to be a parent as they navigate their own identities and the identities present in their respective families. Lived experience can be a challenging and rewarding kind of thing. And so we will explore that. We'll talk about it. We'll get deep into it. And we'll see the ways that that's true for both Grace and Wes. Our time together is designed as a fishbowl conversation. And so that means that this is kind of like a panel, but this is an opportunity to sit back, listen, and hear the less formal, more unfiltered version of what people do when they talk amongst friends. So myself, Carrie, we'll kind of be a part of this conversation along with Grace and with Wes. And at you as attendees or you as people who are watching on YouTube, you'll have an opportunity to just kind of sit back and watch. And then if you ever have more questions or want to follow up, join us at a future gathering and we can get into more discussion. So I'm really excited tonight for Grace and Wes to be here. And don't forget that we have all kinds of resources available outside of tonight. We have things on our website, that's qchristian.org, as well as our YouTube, where previous events are all posted there. So let's sit back, relax, get comfortable, and let's have a great conversation. To get us started, um, Grace, would you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you, Darren, and thank you, Carrie, for inviting me to be here. And Wes, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I do want to say thank you to all of the people that I saw in the room, many of whom I love dearly, that are close personal friends. I'm so grateful for your presence and support tonight. Who am I? I am Grace. I was born a really long time ago. I have been married to Cindy for 48 years, and we dated for 5 years before that. I have three children. Two of them are gay, and both of them are married. I have four grandchildren. I was a evangelical pastor for 32 years. I have only been out to myself as a transgender woman since October of 2016, and I've only been living fully as Grace since January of this year. That decision resulted in some rather hard circumstances. So my wife and I are now separated and walking through what that means for our future. And one of my children, who I trained very well in their conservative theology, is having a really difficult time with not having a dad anymore. And so we're working through some estrangement situations right now. And that's me.
No, I'd really appreciate that. On a side note, I don't think I knew that you were a pastor for 32 years. That's really, really, really powerful. I'm gonna look forward to hearing more about some of that experience. Um, and I totally want to acknowledge that um I appreciate how close a lot of this is. You know, sometimes the stories can be from years and years ago. And so to be willing to show up and talk about right now, that means a lot to me. So thank you for that.
Yep, this is a very messy season right now, so I'm I'm trying to learn a lot, making lots of mistakes, but determined to love my kids and my family and the people in my life as the very best that I can.
Yeah. I so appreciate it, Grace. Your grace is sufficient indeed.
Mm.
Not to be extra Christian punny. Wes, save me.
Save you from your puns.
Yes.
I'll try, though I cannot promise that I won't, in some way accidentally drop a dad joke. Like it happens, it comes
I
out of my
love
mouth.
it.
Um, and yeah, my wife and kids give me a hard time about that. I'm Wes King, and a little bit about me, as Grace was saying, I was born quite a while ago, maybe not quite as long ago as Grace, but I haven't done the math.
I'm not
Um,
saying
There are buses
haven't
to
done
be
all the
tossed
math.
under tonight.
um, but significantly long enough ago that I do have four adult offspring. So that does give a little bit of context, just as Grace's just wonderfully, wonderful history of how long you've been married, which I think is just uh, something that we often valorize in our society, and especially in our Christian society. I was married for 25 years in a very what appeared to be a good Christian marriage. And that's where I had and raised four humans to adulthood. I've kind of known my gender queerness from a young age, but didn't really have language to talk about it. And also my kind of queer affections from, probably high school and on. And, once I got very involved in evangelical Christianity, all of that was the past that we kind of cut off. And, and I had this sense of, if I'm, assigned female at birth, I have no idea how to do that thing. And, if God made me that way, God knows how I should be a woman, and so therefore I will follow, the Christian norms and rules of what it means to be a good Christian woman, and tried that for 25 years very unsuccessfully, always bumping up against the, kind of the stained glass ceilings in many different respects, because of my gender queerness. And finally got language for that around 2013, and conversations with my ex partner, and decided it was time to come out, and left the relationship for other reasons besides my gender queerness, but my gender queerness was definitely a factor in the ending of that 25-year marriage. My offspring were 16 and older, so 16, 18, 2022. I did the 2-year plan back then. Um, and so they, it was an interesting experience for them, especially because I had just written a book that was published by University Press on, it was called Facing the Talk, Conversations with My Four Daughters About Sex. And now one of them identifies as genderqueer. And so I have four offspring, and a lot of our history of parenting for assigned female at birth offspring was very gendered. Um, and that was, that was a very interesting experience to kind of come out as queer and to think differently about gender, but it's also part of how I got here. of, understanding and exploring as I had for assigned female at birth humans in the house. What does that mean? And learning about the patriarchy and how that was harming my offspring and constraining me in many ways that sent me to seminary to get some of those questions answered. And through that journey, led me, to where I am today and having a much different and hopefully generous and expansive experience as a genderqueer person. That I'm excited to be a genderqueer parent, and I'm very grateful that my offspring are so welcoming and loving and affirming. In 2019, I met my current partner, wife, and she is a trans woman. And I had the joy of going through that transition with her. When we first met, she was just starting to come out, and so that was just a really interesting experience for my offspring to also witness and participate in. And so now they have me as their parent, and then they have their other mother. Um, and, and so it's quite a fun. We play a lot around with gender and gender terms and gender tropes in many of our conversations.
I so appreciate that. Somehow I think I forgot about the book. Um, and just refresh me. So the book was it a traditional conservative book? Was it what how did it sit in the atmosphere?
Yeah, well, that was fun.
No, no pressure
especially
there, no pressure.
especially because InterVarsity came out as, kind of more anti-gay after the book was published. It was pretty much kind of exploring and exposing a lot of the patriarchy and the problems with purity culture in the context of parenting, and helping parents to kind of face their own stories around sex and sexuality. And that was kind of how we located it. As far as whether I came out as queer affirming in that book, I was not able to. And I was still working through all of that at the time. So I pretty much knew where I was at. However, the publisher, I could not come out one way or another. And so I pretty much, through the stories, through the narratives, described some of the different positions, right? And so that what my offspring were experiencing in their church culture versus what they were experiencing at school and in the media and in the home with their parents, different opinions on those things. And so that's how I navigated a lot of that. So yeah, it did not sell very well because I did not get to hawk it as, the Christian mom that can tell everybody how to talk to your kids about sex. It just
Yeah,
didn't happen.
I feel you. I feel you. Carrie?
Yeah, thanks for those stories. I'm wondering, Grace, if you would like to tell us a bit about your journey to arriving here.
So, like Wes had mentioned, I didn't really have language for what I was experiencing. And in fact, I honestly believe I had not heard or registered the word transgender, even to the point at which I admitted to myself that I was a girl. And and so I can look back and I can see things like, oh yeah, I remember I always wanted to dress like a girl, but I became a Christ follower at age 15 and somehow knew that that wasn't going to fly. And so, you know, categorized that into the forbidden things you should never do category. And on the 3 or 4 times that I did allow myself that engagement, it would last for about 5 minutes before I'd be at the side of my bed repenting and promising never ever to do that again. There were the moments when I would go to marriage conferences, and in those days, there was always a lot of effort made to stereotype the genders. And On more than one occasion, my wife will attest to this, I would come out of those conferences and just kind of casually say, well, I guess we know who the woman is in our relationship, don't we? Because I'd be resonating with, I recognize these are stereotypes, these are, in some ways constructions of culture and so forth, but nonetheless, they felt more natural to me than, the role that I was being given as a male. So I noticed those things, and then when at the age of 61, I'm dating myself now. At the age of 61, I decided to lean into that desire to dress as a female and not throw it away 5 minutes later and repent and never do it again. And I stood in front of the mirror. I was like a sunrise is the way I describe it. How if you're out in the mountains and you can see the sky starting to lighten, and there comes that moment when the sun kind of peaks up above the mountains and it's almost immediately too bright to look at. That was how it felt for me, that I stood there in front of the mirror and just had this realization, oh my, this is who I am. I'm actually a girl. And my second thought was, I'm out of my mind, because who would ever think something like that? I went to Google and I don't know what I typed in, boy or girl in a boy's body, and up pops this word transgender. And I remember feeling so much relief that there were actually other people like me. And so that began my journey of discovery, trying to figure out, is this something real for me? Is it, am I just happy with cross-dressing, or is this something more deep and essential to me? Obviously, I figured out that it was deep and essential, and told my wife a few months later. That began our journey of 7 years trying to figure this out and whether or not we could stay together. That was always my hope and dream, still is my hope and dream. I don't think that's possible now, but um, we haven't, I haven't closed that door yet. So um, we told our kids about 3 years later, so about 5 years, 4 years into the journey. And two of my children that are gay were understanding. I thought that they might be. And as I mentioned, one of my children had a really, really difficult time with it, continues to this day. From there, it looked like we were not going to be able to stay together, and we're thinking about divorce actually a couple of years ago, until we stumbled onto this idea that we came to call our shared sacrifice, which was providing that we would let all of our family know what was happening for me, rather than keeping it this dark secret of the family. So that way there would be no worries about it actually coming out. And that what our goal, or what our attempt was to try to address this, the dysphoria that I was feeling at the time, was that I would be able to travel a couple times a year to conferences as Grace. And one of those conferences was the Reformation Project in Phoenix, Arizona. That was my first one. One of the people that I met at that conference, who's been transformative in my life, is here tonight. So grateful for that. QCF followed quickly on the heels of that. I've become part of the parent team and have found myself doing lots of work with parents of LGBTQ kids. We continued that. My life as Grace continued to grow and expand until we eventually realized that we couldn't duplicate that same kind of growth and expansion on as Cindy's husband, simply because it still needed to be kept quiet on that side. And so I had all of these relationships I was creating and building and these opportunities for service and caring and making a difference in people's lives. And I couldn't do any of that on my side as Cindy's husband. And so we made the decision that that wasn't a sustainable thing for us. We tried it for 3 years almost. And so made the decision for me to transition. I'm now living with one of my children and two of my grandsons. That's one of the great blessings of this, because I get to build more connection with my child, something I was not good at for the first 61 years of my life. And even more than that, I get to build connection with my grandkids and get to do it in a way that is completely different than the way that I parented my kids. And I know we'll get into some of the details of that in a bit. So that's how I got here today.
So appreciate that. And if I heard that moment of the term I've been listening out for of gender euphoria about that sunrise moment and the way that you saw yourself. I'm curious, are there any other moments of gender euphoria as you think about your current family situation or with the grandkids or anything like that?
There's always those moments when you feel like that your family is willing to see you for who you are, and I would call those euphoric moments. I'll share a couple. There was once when I was visiting my son, and we were going to play a video game together, and there was several of us, and the video game allowed you to pick avatars. And before I had a chance to pick mine, my son chose a female avatar for me, knowing that I wouldn't have been able to have made that choice in that moment. I wasn't presenting as Grace at the time, but he did know. And so that was one of those really affirming moments that felt so special and close for me. Another one was with my grandson, my 9-year-old grandson. He When we were figuring out where I was going to live, we were talking to his parent, and I didn't realize that they were going to tell him about this. They decided it's okay for me to come live with them, and I didn't know they were going to tell him about this. So he didn't know anything about this before that. He had never seen me as Grace, and he wouldn't for another number of months. But from the moment that he was told that I saw myself as a girl, they decided to use the name Gigi in place of Grandpa. And from that moment forward, I think without ever missing a beat, I have been Gigi, she, her, ever since, even for the 5 months when he never saw me as Grace. And I have to say, I have to tell one more story. We it was getting close to the point at which that I was going to move in, and he still hadn't seen me as Grace, and this felt like it's going to be like major shock. And how are we going to kind of ease into this so that it isn't so hard for him? And so I asked my child if it'd be all right if one morning when he was staying overnight, if maybe I could present myself as Grace for a few minutes just to give him a chance to kind of acclimate to it in this little private setting. And so I got permission. We did that, and I decided to play this game with him while we were sitting at the table having breakfast. I let him know that I was going to go get dressed and I'd come down and show him what I looked like as Grace. And the game we were going to play was what's the same and what's different. Mm. And so we just sat there and talked through what felt the same to him, what felt different to him. And aside from the clothing that I was wearing, almost everything we talked about were things that were the same. And so we finished the game. I'm feeling really good about this. And we're walking up the stairs to have him brush his teeth, and I'm going to go change back because we're about to go to church. And he stops me at the top of the stairs and he says, I know something else that's the same. You know me, and I know you. And that just melted my heart that he understood. I'm the same person. I love
Mhm.
him just the same. I will always love him. And he can trust that.
Okay. I wasn't planning on crying tonight, but this is fine. Tears are good. So appreciate that, Grace. I really, really do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is open conversation, so we can chat as we feel.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing those moments, Grace. And I, as a genderqueer person, there are some differences because I'm not like going from one place to another.
Right.
And yet there are absolutely aspects of kind of transgressing the boundaries of masculinity or femininity in some way or another that impacts my parenting. And I'm just so grateful that my offspring were able to have some of those conversations with me and ask whether they could still call me mom. And and then one of my offspring bought me a hat that says daddy on it for my birthday. And just the kind of the joking that we're able to do around gender and what we call each other and things like that. But I think one of the most kind of affirming for me as I was exploring my gender queerness after I divorced was dating on OkCupid and having so many options to describe myself that I had never seen before. Terms that, as y'all talked about, like, you can look some of these things up on the internet. Sometimes you'll get good information, sometimes not so much, but um, but just encountering so much diversity that I believe is part of God's glorious creation, the diversity of humanity, and having more ways to think about myself and describe myself was just so fabulous. And I was dating women, I was dating men, I was trying to find people who were, gender queer or trans, or, to just be open to any human, right? That was interesting. And when I met my wife and talked to her a little bit about my gender queerness, it was just so liberating to have someone who understood and celebrated all of those aspects of me, and that I didn't have to perform some kind of femininity for her. I didn't have to perform some kind of masculinity for her. I could do all of those things or none of those things or various, iterations and combinations of those things. And also I was able to see her and, be one of the first that was calling her she, her, no matter how she was presenting. And I so identify, Grace, when you were talking about that halftime, in one presentation and halftime in another presentation, because I lived with my wife going through that for a long time before she fully transitioned. And having people who are able to say, I see you,
Mm.
is just, it's so magical. And one of the most magical things for me is my youngest offspring, who for years and years and years, right, would look at pictures of me when I was a kid and think that they were pictures of them. Um, identifies as non-binary, and and we get to celebrate, so much of that. And so it's just like, wow, to be able to see and be seen by my and within my family system is just very, very, very powerful and affirming.
Our kids can be so wise. I remember sitting with Cindy telling one of our kids about my plans to transition, and really wanting, support. And I have that from two of my children, and also from my dad, which is surprising, maybe because he's just turned 95 years old. So, and he's been one of my strongest supporters. But I remember my son looking at us both and saying, I want to support you both. And I know that this is hard for both of you in different ways. And I just have to tell you that I can't support you both when you're both in the same room, because you both have different needs. And for me to offer support to one of you would necessarily feel bad to the other. So just understand, I'm with you in this journey, but I need to support you as individuals, not as a couple anymore. It was such a wise thing that he said to us, and really helped me to recognize the enormous challenge that he was facing as a child with a transgender parent that is impacting the relationship that he has known all of his life. And so I'm really grateful for the ways that our kids show up and help us to learn how to love them well, how to accept their love. I
Yeah,
wanted to, oh, go ahead, Wes.
well, I was just thinking our parents too, right? Just, especially from such a different generation, right?
Yeah,
And it's got to be challenging. My mom, interestingly, I changed my name multiple times before I came out as genderqueer. And so for the first 25 years, I went by Wendy. For the next 25 years, I went by Elizabeth. I didn't like legally change my name because Elizabeth was my middle name. But then when I came out as genderqueer and I'm trying to figure out, do I want to change my name? What does that mean for me? And I was kind of in this, you know, liminal space, right? This space in between. And I heard about the MX, gender neutral term of address, and I couldn't decide what name I wanted. And so I went by Mix We. Um, I don't remember, Darren and Carrie, if you remember those days. Before I got my PhD and was going to be Doctor something, I didn't know what that something was going to be. And so I went by Mix We. And I remember my mom, and I even got this like embroidered on the interior of a custom blazer that my wife bought me. And she was like, you'll always be my offspring, my kid. And so just, WE just stands for whatever. And so I got hashtag whatever and embroidered on the inside. And it was her way of just accepting me and all of the changes that she's seen me go through in my life. And I'm just so grateful for that. Sometimes it's hard. Like the time that she was like, "Oh yeah, you stuck your finger in a socket. Maybe that's why you're queer." Comments that came out, which were just kind of hard. But I'm like, okay, I get it. You're trying to figure out, and this is what parents often do, right? Is they try and figure out, how did I miss this? How did I not see this, or what did I not observe? And I'm sure for our kids too, right? Especially those of us coming out later in life, like, what did I, they might be asking themselves, well, how did I not see this, or what did I miss? And I really try to hold on to the times, and as you were saying, Grace, of those experiences of feeling seen and
yeah,
and being supported by our family. And I'm just really grateful that I have that. I'm grateful that you have that too. Thank you for sharing your stories. And you
yeah.
were
Thank you, Wes.
share something else. So I'm tossing it back over.
You actually alluded to it, this name and pronouns and titles and all of the complexity of that. I realized for most of the time that I was on this journey with my family that I was doing my very best to insulate them from actually having to deal with the emotions and the challenge of me changing genders. And so, especially during the period of our shared sacrifice, I was always showing up in the way that people expected me to show up. And so essentially, they had no real necessity to try to adapt or even understand or address what was happening, because I've spent so much energy trying to protect them from it. And name and pronouns and titles were one of the ways that I did that with them. Was, just call me Greg, call me he, him. That's what I look like, so call me that. And and dad, and whatever feels comfortable for you. And then I transitioned fully, and I realized that this is going to be the first time in 7 years that anybody's actually going to have to stop and think about, how am I going to respond now? Because now there isn't a Greg anymore. The name is legally changed. By the way, I love my name, Grace. I go to all of these Christian conferences. My name is on the screen all the time. It's wonderful. But so all of a sudden I realized, this is the first time anybody's actually had to decide, are they going to respond to me as Grace or not? And that feels really tricky with kids, because with kids, you want to be the safe, secure person where they can come and be attached and find all of the needs that they're having to, so you can be there for them in those moments. You're not wanting, as a parent, to ask anything of your kids. You're certainly not wanting them to support you or validate you and so on. That's what you have friends for. That's what you have a spouse for. And yet I found myself really struggling at times, wanting to be seen by my kids and having to let go of that.
Mhm.
And I still want to be seen by my one child who is having such a hard time with this and from whom I'm estranged. But I'm also working very hard to make sure I get the support that I need from friends, so that whenever that moment comes when we get to have the conversation about what this has meant and how hard this has been and the emotions that she's had, I'll be able to be in that conversation as a sturdy parent who's there to listen and to validate and to repair if that's possible. And so I realize now that name and pronouns are actually more important than I thought they were. And so we've been gently having the conversation about, this is who I am now. This is the legal name that I go by. This is how I want to be buried when I die. Um, in particular, Cindy and I are working this out, and I think probably that relationship is most important to me. And there was a long time when she said, I'll never be able to call you Grace. It wasn't a malicious thing that she was saying. It was, I just can't get there emotionally. And then I transitioned, and bless his heart, my little grandson, he decided on his own that it was time for people to make the change. And so when we'd be together and maybe playing a game or something, and somebody would slip up and call me by the wrong pronouns or the wrong name, he would immediately chime in, no, it's she, her. And at one point I was talking to my therapist about this and realizing that I was actually probably leaning on him, my little 9-year-old, a little bit too hard to, have these conversations for me, and that wasn't fair to him. And, so we were in the car one day and Cindy was there and I'm talking about this and I'm saying, really, we're the adults in the room. We should probably be figuring this out and not, leaving that to him. And so, we were saying, you don't have to correct us anymore. And he got all quiet and sad. And he then says afterwards, I forget, we called him kind of affectionately the pronoun police. And we told him he didn't have to be that anymore. And he got quiet and sad and said, but I like being the pronoun police. so he's continued to fill that role, but the conversation itself has changed. Now there's a real concerted effort to notice and to attempt to offer respect. And I know how hard this is for my wife and for my family. And so it's not lost on me. It does feel like a sacrifice that they're making. It does feel like they are choosing to love when it's hard for them to do that they're doing it for my sake. And I also want to be mindful of the things that they need, and to the degree that I can offer it without stepping back from who I am as Grace, I'm more than willing to do that so that we can continue on together in whatever capacity that we can.
One of the hardest kind of family dynamics for my wife and I that we're encountering is our aging parents and dementia.
Yeah.
And, being the correcting for pronouns and such, and that kind of, they're losing their capacities is so hard.
Yeah.
And
yeah. My dad's getting me too.
How do we make space for that potential reality for us?
My dad has never used my name Grace, even when we're on the phone together, and I haven't asked him to do that. I did say earlier that he was supportive, and he is. He was one of the only people in my family who actually looked at some of the things I posted, some of the previous videos and interviews that I've done. At one point, we had this really incredible conversation where, he says to me after listening to my story about what it was like to finally admit that I'm trans, he apologized to me. And he said, I used to think that you were being selfish by this thing that you were doing. And you're making it so hard on all of the rest of us. He said, now I realize I'm the one who's being selfish by not allowing you to be the person that you really are. And so I'm sorry. This is my 93-year-old dad at the time telling me this. And I realized that I still need my parents. My mom's gone. I wish she was still here. I would love to ask her if she saw any of this coming when I was a kid. She died a number of years ago. But I realized I still need my dad. And I spent my whole life trying not to need anybody. But now that I've accepted I'm trans and I know that I need people in this world in ways that I didn't understand before, I realize I need my dad. And thankfully, he's been there for me to the best of his ability. I'm grateful for that.
For one of my parents, so my dad, there's kind of this family mythology that exists that my mom cried when I was born because societally, right, everybody wanted a son, right? And the firstborn and my older sibling is assigned female at birth, and she's wonderful and amazing. And so I don't know when I heard that, probably later in life when I was being the tomboy that I was. And so there was this, even in college, I was, trying to be this, the son that my dad always wanted. kind of that idea. He passed before any of this happened, so I have no idea, right? How
Yeah.
he would react. And my mom and I have had multiple conversations about it. My sister and I, she used to call me Sissy all the time, and I would call her Sissy, and that was kind of our thing. And so she's come up with a new term for me. I'm hissy.
I love that.
So you never know what family's going to do when you're when you're in these spaces.
Well, it just goes to show the power that there can be in a name or a way of referring to someone. It can be done with love and with affection, and it means so much. Or it can be done with, I don't know how to say it, with rejection, so to speak. No, you're Greg, you'll always be Greg. And so, don't ever expect me to use any other name than that. Thankfully, I have no one that I know of in my family that's choosing that course, but it would be so very hard if they did.
So appreciate all of this. I'm wondering, um, I'm wondering if there are reflections or moments that stand out to you about your relationships to church, in your various experiences and contexts. What does that look like?
I've been doing a lot of talking tonight, Wes. I'm happy to answer this one, but do you want to tackle that one first?
I'll start off. I was kind of very involved in a megachurch, an evangelical megachurch, and um, wanted to be in leadership. And when I first started at that church, they had a dress code for the women on staff. Women had to wear, skirts and pantyhose, and women
Sundays only or all the time?
no when they worked on, at the staff, like all week long. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, this was the 90s. And they went from, being very anti-homosexual and having those kind of, very restrictive gender roles, no female pastors, no, elders who were, female identifying. And then, changes over time to having, ordained women pastors, right? That was a big deal, being a part of that. And this was when I was on staff. So I was a director because I wasn't allowed to be a pastor. And I hadn't gone to seminary yet, and all of that kind of stuff. And during that time, I was just starting out in seminary and wrestling with so many of these questions about why women can or can't be in leadership, because I could go be a missionary and be a leader, elsewhere. And there's so many problems with that whole concept. We don't need to get into all those details, but I remember going through so many of those changes and, having the pastor come in and ask me for advice and things like that. And then once I got into seminary and, was doing work on this, then the next pastor who was tackling the, being welcoming and affirming, right? So moving away from, so first they had to accept the women, and then they had to accept the gays. Those, as part of this, progression of being more progressive, right? Big deal. And I was, I was consultant on a lot of those things, which was interesting to me, right? So somehow there was this, acknowledgement or observation that, I had some lived experience that was relevant, and also some, knowledge and expertise as I was, getting more educated, and being accepted and respected, but still only to a degree, right? And that was really challenging. And the church landed on being welcoming but not affirming, and that's kind of what I did my master's thesis on. How this church moved from hosting Exodus conferences to, being welcoming and changing their theology even just a little bit. And so eventually, I could no longer be there. I was an adjunct at a seminary that, required us to sign a statement of faith that included that marriage is between a man and a woman. So I had to quit teaching at that seminary. And that was a really hard decision, but the right decision. I stand by it. And, just feeling like I was never allowed to really flourish and be the leader that I am and the teacher that I am in those spaces because of patriarchy was just really hard. And I'm very, very grateful for QCF to have space to be all of those kinds of things that I was not allowed to be for 30 years. And I haven't found a church community locally that feels safe to me yet. And so I'm fortunate to have other queer community that I'm a part of. And this, QCF community has been very life-giving to me and helps me stay connected to, what's been such a big part of my life. And so that's a little bit of how kind of my connections with church. I also study religion and technology, and so that's another way, for me, because like part of my connection with, my Christianity is very much related to this, knowing and perceiving and understanding and there's definitely a charismatic kind of connection of having discernment and having being able to perceive things in ways that that many other people aren't able to. And so for me it's really helpful to be able to stay connected and to be thinking with and through theological anthropology. What does it mean to be human? From a kind of a queer perspective. So queer theology is one of my favorite kind of things to think about in relationship to my experience with Christianity. And I'm just very grateful for those others who are out there doing all this writing and helping me to stay engaged. And so that I don't have to do the writing because, I already wrote a book and I'm not doing that again right now.
I'm really glad you get your voice today, Wes. That's such an important part for all of us to be able to be heard. We all have something to add to the conversation that that everyone else needs to know about. So thank you for pressing hard to get to where you are. My experience was obviously quite different. I was the male pastor who got to stand in front of the congregation and tell them, "Thus saith the Lord." So I never pressed up against any of those challenges to have my voice heard. When I came out to myself as transgender, one of the things that I said to myself immediately was, well, that will be the end of my voice. I've now condemned myself to just quietly living out my life. Obviously, that's not turned out to be the case. That God somehow manages to make sure that we are able to be heard, and I'm so very grateful for that. But I will say, in my experience in the church, what motivated me was wanting to change the legacy for myself and my family, as well as other families. And what I mean by that is I came from this family where my dad left us from the time I was 5 until the time I was 18. Very little contact in between. My mom married an alcoholic, and that brought with us its own sets of challenges. I was that child who did not know if they were loved. If you're familiar with attachment theory, I am your classic anxiously attached kid who's always afraid they're going to be abandoned. Carried that into my relationships as an adult. It was the perfect combination for being a pastor. because it leads to people pleasing. You know, you're afraid of being abandoned, and so you're always doing what you think people need or want from you, which dovetails nicely with what supposedly the pastoral role is. But my goal in going into ministry and in the sermons that I would preach every week was, let's love our kids. Let's love our families, our spouses. Let's hold this thing together and let people know that they matter. And let's not have any families like mine ever again. That was my mission. I can't, I can't believe how ineffective I was at that because of the theology that I chose to believe wholeheartedly. I remember raising my kids not to be securely attached to me, although I wanted them to know that they were loved, but I raised them to be obedient children. That was the pinnacle of success. I believed that if I could get my kids to obey me, then that would enable them to obey God. So that was my mission. And so I spent their whole lives monitoring behavior, controlling behavior, trying to make sure that they didn't get into trouble, that they didn't have, that their emotions were completely under control, which translates into you don't get to have emotions at all. And so I ended up teaching my kids to be anxiously and avoidantly attached because I never let them experience their emotions. That was how I handled my own emotions. I shut them down. And I thought I was offering them this really holistic way of going through life. You never have to feel anything. You just simply do the right thing and it all works out. I mean, it sounds so supremely naive at this point, but I believed it. Hook, line, and sinker, and I worked hard for it. And we ended up with this family that never has conflict because we don't ever say anything that's really real. And now I have come out as trans, and it has created enormous need for contact and connection and working through kind of all of these things that were layered on at childhood and just perpetuated for decades. And in some cases, my kids don't have the resources to be able to have those conversations. I didn't have those resources. I've spent the last 3 years working very hard to revive the emotions I shut down for so long, try to understand what happened to me as a kid. Why am I so afraid in relationships of being abandoned? How can I become more securely attached to the friends in my life so that I can be a person who can securely attach to their children and not more importantly, and their grandchildren, so that this legacy that I created thinking I was working so hard, and I was trying to change the legacy of my family, I think for the first time now as Grace, understanding what it actually means to love yourself, and not in this sort of self-focused way, but to love the fact that this is who I am, and to know that I'm lovable as a person, and to be able to offer that to my family. That's what I'm trying to do these days. And that's what wakes me up every morning.
Thanks for sharing so many intimate details. It is, for me, I identify with your story of kind of looking back on, how did I parent and what do I do now? And, even when I first kind of came out as genderqueer and kind of reflecting back on the ways that my ex and I parented, in a lot of ways, we were queering the traditional family from the get-go, largely because of other factors that that I don't think I necessarily need to name, but there are definitely neurodiversities involved in some of those factors. But neither of us were the traditional, according to our gender, neither of us fit that. And we somehow found ways to negotiate those things, even within the system, which I think is very um, I'm I'm very grateful that we were able to do that for the sake of our children so that they didn't have this extreme stereotype of this is what a man should, and because this is the way my dad was. Their dad was not, hyper masculine or anything like that. And he's the one who did a lot of the cooking around the house, and we kind of negotiated our roles because neither of us really fit the traditional gender roles.
Yeah, that's how
And
it worked in our family as well. I talked about feeling like I was the woman in the relationship, so we really pressed for an egalitarian approach. I know it wasn't because so much still falls to the woman, even when you try to make it an egalitarian relationship. But we
yeah,
definitely weren't, nobody was obeying me, at least at the marriage level, but it was definitely a belief that I had for my kids. And I so regret that these days.
yeah, it's been a lot to work through some of that with my kids and all of the varieties of, even their neurodiversities and how that kind of plays in. And so, for me, it's not just about the gender queerness. It's about so many of the different diversities that we have within, just my four offspring, right? And my ex and I, and then my wife, and all of that. And I just celebrate the glorious goodness of all of our diversities and varieties
Mhm.
and particularities and positionalities and all of those things. And I'm really grateful to have had those rich experiences. And I'm especially grateful, Grace, that I got to share this space with you
Yeah,
and
thank
to
you,
hear
Wes.
about your experiences. Very, very thankful for your sharing.
Thank you too.
Y'all are absolutely wonderful to just be in the presence of, to see the ways that you reflect what's going on and how it affects you and all of that. Um, I am, yeah, I'm thinking in the last few minutes we have, if you, yeah, if you could just tell us or share with us or share with those who are watching. I mean, it's still a conversation between the two of you, but what are you passionate about? What are you dreaming about for the future? What do you hope for in this big, wild and adventurous world?
Wes?
I got to go first again. All right. What was it I wrote in my bio here? Wes enjoys encouraging young queer people and imagining anti-racist and anti-capitalist futures. It's absolutely a big part of what I'm hoping and dreaming for the future, and uh, the possibilities and holding on to those possibilities is so important for me. Anti-sexist policies and, a future that, allows allows more space for human flourishing in all of our glorious diversities and particularities, right? Like I've used that kind of framing, a couple of times here, and that's so important to me to participate in changing the systems that exist so that we as humans can flourish in multiplicity of ways, that we are able to kind of break down and tear down the systems of oppression that have limited us from being fully who we are.
For me, I think there's three things that really motivate me. One of them is friendship. I call myself an evangelist for friendship these days. I never knew what was possible in a friendship, and there are so many people on this call that I would call very dear, deep friends who I I love in ways that I didn't know were possible to love, and I am loved in ways that I didn't know was possible to be loved. And that's all been a result of trying to figure out how to show up as a securely attached parent for my kids. And I discover it works across all relationships. And so I like to talk about that. I also love talking to parents, especially parents with gender expansive kids. So often it seems like those are difficult conversations for parents, especially out of conservative backgrounds, to be able to have with their kids. And so if there's any way that I can bridge that gap for them, I love doing that. And then because I was an evangelical pastor for 32 years, and I understand kind of the mindset and the way in which the Bible is brought to bear on these conversations, I find myself called to spaces that are trying to figure this out. And so I was at the CCDA conference, Christian Community Development Association conference in Portland recently, and I was up at Wheaton College for creating communities of care in these spaces where people are genuinely trying to love others and yet also feeling really constrained by some theologies that are creating dissonance within our own heart, but they don't have freedom yet to be able to figure that out. And so showing up in those spaces and letting them see a transgender person who is deeply in love with Jesus, who loves people in ways that she was never able to do throughout the majority of her life, and that there is flourishing in when people are enabled to live into who God made them to be. I find that enormously satisfying, and so far I've been very well received in the spaces where I've been, and looking forward to more opportunities as we go further on.
Thank you both for sharing your vision casting and what you're interested in doing next. I'm thinking about us being in this space where we have people listening and observing and relating, hopefully, or thinking about their own lives in some way. And I'm noticing how reflective both of you are by nature. And I don't know if that is by nature since birth or that's by nature since an awakening in your lives. But I'm wondering, in closing, if you can talk a little bit about the role of reflection in your life, and if you have any encouragement to the audience for all of us to be reflecting.
You got to go first on this one, Grace.
All right, thanks, Wes. I'll just point to two passages of scripture that have been transformative for me in this journey of reflection. One of them is Jesus's description of what's most important: love God and love your neighbor as yourself, and then saying that all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. And I remember deciding I really want to put those at the top, and I want to actually do what Jesus said and hang everything else from them. And so it's been quite the journey of reading through the scripture and discovering that there are some things that hang really easily from those two commands. I kind of view it like a baby's mobile, where those commands are at the top, and then you're hanging all of these different things from that mobile. There are other things that I run across in scripture that I find are very difficult to hang from that mobile. Some of the references to slavery, the ways that women were asked to engage, and so forth. And I look at those passages and I hold them with mystery and say that I clearly don't understand how they hang. And so because there is so much that hangs easily, I can choose to focus on those things that are easily aligned with loving my neighbor as myself. And then there's this passage in Galatians chapter 5. There's actually three. I'll just stop with the second one. But this passage in Galatians chapter 5, which talks about the fruit of the Spirit being love, joy, peace, patience, and the other five. But it's the last sentence of that section that has really enlivened me, where it says, "There's no law against such things." I was raised my kids under what I might call the Old Testament 2.0. I just took the New Testament and made a whole bunch of laws out of it. And I remember reading this passage and thinking, there's no law against love. There are no parameters. There are no boxes to be placed around it. That means I get to look at you, Wes, and I get to ask, what do you need? And I get to love you according to what you need. And I can look at you, Darren, and you, Carrie, and all of the people in this room and the people I come across every day. And I don't have to fit them into a box like I tried to do with my kids. I get to ask them, what do you need? And because there's no law against love, if it's within my power to offer it, I get to do that. I'm finding such joy and such connection and such fruit in living my life that way. And so when it comes to reflection, I'm always asking myself, does this hang from those two commands? And does this box people in? Or does this free us to love anybody that we see? If I can answer yes to those two questions, I feel free to move forward. And I'm finding great joy in doing it.
For me, I don't know if it's always been this way, as you were saying, Gary, or not. I started, a diary when I was 16, and I kept journaling for many years. On New Year's Day, I used to kind of have a practice where I would like fast and pray and review my journals for the year, and then as a survivor of trauma and abuse in a very violent home, being raised and going to therapy has been another kind of aspect of my going through the process of, what some people might call inner healing, right? Has helped me to really learn some practices that I think are super helpful in being reflective of, who I am and my influence as well. One of the things that my wife and I talk about in our relationship skills is intent versus impact. And it's not just about the good intentions, but also the impact. And so, journaling, having those kind of self-reflective practices, but also being in community with people that, we can have those kinds of reflecting back to each other what the impact of our lived experiences with each other can be has been a cornerstone. But also, kind of broadly, when I think of a Bible passage that has had a big impact on my life, it's related to my history of violence and trauma and abuse, and committing to breaking the cycle. Be angry and sin not. And so learning how to be angry, and that there is such a thing as righteous anger. And I think a lot of that motivates my ability to do work, and to be able to reflect on the role that anger can play in motivating change, systemic change, social change, change within relationships, and that anger doesn't necessarily have to result in violence, and that there are ways to be at peace with all men and women and all people of all genders, while also being angry and not sinning in that culture, and sometimes not being angry can be a violation of God's intention for the flourishing of humanity.
That's an emotion that I'm really working to try to access. It's very scary for me. I had a problem with it big time early on in life, and I managed to learn to shut it down. And the idea of actually letting it be expressed in the ways that you just described is still a work in progress for me. And thank you for naming also the importance of therapy. That's something new for me in the last year or two that I'm finding enormously beneficial. And also community. I'm a part of a couple of groups that where I'm able to just speak into the room anything that's on my heart, and I get honest feedback and really probing questions, and it's such an important part of that process. Thanks for naming that, Wes. A lot of those people are in this room tonight.
So thank you both. So we are at 8:30 Eastern, which is our closing time for tonight. And so I just want to invite anyone here who is observing to drop into the chat up to 3 words that are kind of a capture or a takeaway or a learning or a little bow for you for tonight. So that might be emotional response or somatic response or thinking response, but up to 3 words that sort of capture your experience of tonight. And yeah, thank you for being here. In December, we're going to have a Christmas social during our time on that first Sunday. So we will be sending out an email about wearing a funky sweater if you are a person who wears funky sweaters, and bringing a Christmas carol or a piece of music to share, or I don't know, a holiday joke or something like that. So that's what we're going to do together in December. And then in January, we are off for the month because we'll be focusing on the new year and the conference. And then we're back together in February. So folks are dropping into the chat some really lovely things around their captures for tonight. So I just encourage everyone to go ahead and read the chat as you are departing out of the space tonight, and just kind of think about the role of reflection for yourselves, and yeah, reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight, for taking time out of your lives to listen to stories, and so grateful for all of you taking the time, and for you, Carrie and Darren, for making it possible, and Wes for your vulnerability and openness tonight. It's been a privilege.
Absolutely. Love you both to bits and pieces. And looking forward to the next time we get to see each other and give hugs if you're open to that.
Yes.
Awesome. All right.
Yes,
Thank you,
yes to the
everyone.
hugs.
Have a great night. Thanks for being.
Bye-bye. Love it.